Hello, my name is Nicole Ersch, and I am with Midwest Bank Center. Thank you for joining us for our virtual fireside chat with Jim McKelvey as we discuss his book, The Innovation Stack, Building an Equitable Business One Crazy Idea at a Time, and apply his framework to building a more equitable region. As a friendly reminder, please mute your phones or the microphones on your computers. Our guest speaker today is Jim McKelvey. Jim is a serial entrepreneur, investor, philanthropist, author, and artist. He is the co-founder of Square and served as the chairman of its board until 2010 and still serves on the board of directors. In 2011, his iconic card reader design was inducted into the Museum of Modern Art. Jim founded Invisibly, an ambitious project to rewire the economics of online content in 2006. He also serves as a deputy chair of the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Our moderator today is Orv Kimbrough. Orv is the chairman and CEO of Midwest Bank Center, the St. Louis region's second largest privately held bank. If you'd like to be entered to win a 1-hour session with Jim where you can discuss your big idea, please email heyorvstl@midwestbankcenter.com by the end of the day today, and we will randomly select one winner and reach out to you via email. Gentlemen, I'll kick it off to you to begin our discussion.
Thanks, Nicole. Jim, I wore my T-shirt today in honor of you. Jim, tell us a bit about how you grew up and whether you prefer streaming music or records.
I grew up without the money to buy records, so I never really accumulated them. And then when CDs came out, I thought they were really cool. So they were, they're all shiny and sort of like a little woodland creature. I was attracted to the sort of sparkliness of CDs. And I have a bunch of CDs because I used to have a company that made CD storage cabinets. But I'm a streaming guy. Tidal and Spotify.
Yeah, I do some streaming, but I'm also back into records. I didn't grow up with records, but I'm back into them now.
Is that just to be cool?
Yeah, it absolutely is to be cool, Jim.
Well, that plus the T-shirt, and you run a pretty cool bank.
Yeah,
okay, it fits.
Yeah, it fits. So, Jim, what's an innovation stack?
So it's like an immune reaction. It's this thing you have to do to survive. So I started doing this research on why Square survived Amazon, and I discovered that the companies throughout history who had similar experiences had all evolved this thing that was sort of unlike other businesses. And I called it an innovation stack because there was sort of no way otherwise to describe all the little things you do to make yourself different. And I do this in a business context, but it may have relevance in other areas. But basically, Orv, it's a series of independent innovations that collectively will produce something totally new. So in Square's case, we did 14 things differently than other companies. And if you removed any of those 14, it might not have worked, but collectively it worked. And then I studied Southwest Airlines. They did about 17 things differently. Bank of America, which is another case study I used, they had well over a dozen as well. So it turns out that this was sort of a revelation to me because I always thought of innovation as sort of like one or two big ideas. And what I realized is that one or two big ideas is not normally how it happens, at least with the significant innovations. It's usually streams of ideas and these stacks that I describe in the book.
So in the book, you talk about finding inspiration by looking back at history, and you spent some time talking about the Bank of Italy. And so I want you to tell that story, and I can't help but wonder if there's a correlation to what's happening right now with the pandemic.
I think there is. And, history had to be my guide because I couldn't find any contemporary examples when I started looking around, and it turns out that most businesses are copies of other functioning businesses. So, well, I mean, you guys are a good example, right? Midwest Bank Center is a bank, and you're not that different than other banks. I mean, but if you look back at the history of banking, there was one bank that sort of started it all, and it was the Bank of Italy. And a lot of the things that you guys do was sort of invented there. Consumer loans, house financing, the fact that you could walk in and talk to a teller, the fact that you will bank normal people. Like banking used to be reserved for the elite. So when I was doing my historical studies, I found this guy. His name was A.P. Giannini, and he was a produce vendor. He basically made a fortune selling lettuce and walnuts and other produce. Retired, and when he retired, he was still pretty young. He was 31, and joined the board of a bank. And this was a traditional bank back, 100 years ago. And at the time, banking was basically reserved for the elites. And if you didn't know a banker or have friends of a banker, or you were of a certain social class, you didn't have access to loans. You didn't have access to even safe places to store money. I mean, there were a lot of things that we just take for granted today that banking avails us, but this was only available to the elites. And this man got frustrated because he saw, people that he knew who couldn't get loans. And so he decided to start his own bank. And in doing so, he sort of started building an innovation stack. So he was doing things differently enough from the traditional banks that by the end, he had built something that looked totally unlike the other banks. And the reason it's not so shocking today is because that's basically, over the last 100 years, what became banking. His ideas were so powerful that nowadays that's what we think of as banking. But this was not what banking was like a century ago. So it's a fantastic industry to be in, because it really was the industry that led me to discover this power. When I saw A.P. Giannini and I realized what he was doing in an industry like banking, where, I mean, let's face it, you don't think of banking as a very innovative industry on a daily basis. It's not, considered sexy or tech cool to be in banking, but it turns out that a lot of the things that really make people's lives better are things that banks do, and a lot of the things that banks fail to do can hurt us. And I remember when Boatman's left St. Louis, they didn't really leave St. Louis. They got bought by, Nations, and the Nations got bought by BOA. So now it's technically Bank of America, but it's not Boatman's anymore. They don't have any local DNA, right? They don't care about St. Louis. And you can tell. And they stopped making a lot of loans to small businesses that Boatman's used to make.
I wrote a paper some time ago called David versus Goliath, the fight to keep community in banking, with basically that basic idea that when you bank local with a community bank, these folks have your best interest at heart. You're not just a number or a statistic. You have created Square, and your primary objective was to serve the lower end of the market. When you look at the United States right now, there's bifurcation happening. You have more people who are on the wealth side and more people who are on the low to moderate income side. That middle is being squeezed. I'm seeing more and more payday loans and lenders who essentially charge you 15% for every $100, which annualizes it at about 400%. What thoughts do you have on that end of the market?
They're very mixed. I hate the fact that we need payday lending, but I say that we need it. And the answer is, although I've never used it myself, well, actually I did a little bit, but I've never had to get a cash advance, but when I've occasionally gone in there to, get some service or something. But we can't deny that there is some need in society that's being met by the services they provide. I mean, usury as the rates are, it's arrogant to sit there as somebody who's always had access to traditional financial systems and say, well, payday loans should be stopped, right? Because if payday loans were stopped, you'd probably have something worse fill its place. But the question, I think, is what's the need that they're fulfilling, and could that need be, supplied for, a whopping 30% APR as opposed to 400% APR? And are there things that we can do to connect people to the system? Because it's the same problem that Giannini faced, right? So he didn't have payday lenders, but he saw his people, getting exploited and hurt. And if you have seen a payday lender and you know people who've gotten stuck because they miss a car payment and then they get into trouble, and then that whole system is like designed to prey on weakness and desperation. And I hope there's a better way. So we're still not able to answer the question of what replaces them. And I don't know, but it's a good question to ask.
So going to my next question, Jim, and really tied back to this whole idea of creating an equitable region, St. Louis has always held one of the top 2 or 3 positions in terms of most charitable regions in the U.S. Yet when it comes to outcomes for poor and marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown, our region ranks at the bottom on almost any measure you care to analyze. When you hear the phrase creating an equitable region, what comes to mind?
Well, I think of Del Mar. I think of the divide. I mean, we have a city that's so divided that it was the focus of a BBC special, right? There are people in London talking about how if you're living north of Del Mar, your house is worth 30 grand. If you're living south of Del Mar, it's worth 300 grand. And that's world news, folks. That's not even national news. That's going out by the BBC. I think of the divide, and I think about the fact that we are one of the most segregated cities in the country. And the philanthropic stuff, first of all, I didn't know we were top in philanthropy. That's sort of a new fact that I literally just learned. And I wonder who tabulates that, right? But whatever. The fact is that we're still a divided city, and we're divided in a lot of ways, and I'm hoping that we can eliminate those divisions. Part of it's going to be, formally, politically. Part of it is also hopefully going to be, socially. And I don't have the answers there, but it's a problem that I think we do well to discuss.
I was having a conversation with a business owner last week, and he asked me the difference between equity and equality. What would be how would you describe the two, equity versus equality?
I never used the term equity, and maybe I should. And I don't even use the term equality. Because they're sort of heavyweight terms. I think in terms of, sort of fairness, and maybe that's probably not linguistically current, but, I just think about what it was like for some of my friends who had different circumstances than I had, and how fair that is. And there's some fairness that's just built into the system, right? There's some unfairness that's built into the system, right? But then there's other unfairness that's structural, that we intentionally put there. And that's the stuff that's, I think, the most concerning to me, is when you've got efforts that are sort of designed and devised to divide. They're purposely set up for the purposes of splitting us apart. And, I listen to some of the political rhetoric and I hear those words, the words of division. And that ain't healthy, right? And yet in St. Louis, quite frankly, division does benefit some people, right? So if you're in a segregated city, which we are, and you're on the right side of that line, life's pretty good, and you can ignore the stuff that's happening on the other side of the line. And I think in terms of fairness, or I just, it's, and I don't always know what's fair, but these are problems I still wrestle with. I don't have clean answers.
Yeah. So I think about equality as sameness, treating everybody the same, no matter what. And equity recognizes that, as you pointed out so well, that we all start in different places. I grew up in the foster care system. That's a completely different place than most people. And so equity recognizes that each individual needs something different. So in my household, I have 2 kids. They're different. I don't treat them equally. I treat them equitably. I give them what they need to thrive and to be successful, and it's different for both of them.
Yeah, it's interesting, because on an individual basis you can do that. On a societal basis, you try to write laws and rules, right? But then the other thing you do is you have these unwritten rules, right? So I'm looking at Amy Sharp. She's a friend of mine. She's on this Zoom meeting with me. And when Amy and I were in school, blacks and whites didn't date. Like, that was pretty controversial. I had a friend, he was black, and he took a white girl to one of the dances, and people were talking about it. It was a big deal. These days, it's not a big deal. Somehow we've gotten over that in the last 30 years. But, there's still a lot of adhesions that we've got that are social, and they're still a big deal. But look, generally we're making progress. I just think St. Louis is not quite making enough progress. Like, I really wish we could get something going that took we got 100,000 people below the poverty line in our town. Like, what if we could somehow get those people a little more access, a little more fill in the blank, right? Safety, security, fairness, opportunity, whatever. How would we as a region respond if we had 100,000 people who could be more productive? That'd be wonderful. I don't know how to do it, but it's worth talking.
Yeah, you said something that's so important. Equity is about access at its core. And, when it comes to predicting how long you will live, your zip code in St. Louis is more important than your genetic code. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Jim, you said building an innovation stack all begins by choosing to solve a problem that no one has ever solved before. Squaring up, righting a wrong, or solving an unsolved problem forces you to be creative, even when you don't want to be. I know that you looked to the past to find mentors, as I said earlier, who created their own innovation stack. In your research, did you happen to find any examples of individuals who built their social justice efforts using the innovation stack method?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I did not. I did not look for social justice. And the reason I didn't do that is because I didn't have a way to measure it. So the thing about measuring businesses is you can look for money. And if they pile up a bunch of money, then you say they're successful. And at some point, it's the same way I do with my art. I make glass, right? And I sell something, and I still sell my work. And I sell my work these days for the feedback, right? Like I want to know if that thing is worth $200 to you or $500 to you or $1,000 to you. Like if I don't, and I know that's not its intrinsic worth as a piece of art, but it is this sort of proxy. Like, do you like it in blue or green, right? And so I know it's a cop out, and I know if I was a true artist, I would be able to sit there and say, well, this work stands on its own and I don't really care about money. But I always have to use some sort of objective measurement, and whether or not somebody feels about a piece of art, I can't measure, but I can measure money. So when I did my research, I would have loved to do social justice. I would have loved to have applied the theories of the innovation stack, which I think apply to areas that are not monetarily defined. But in my research, I didn't do any, because how are you gonna say if it's any good? Like how are you gonna, I would argue that Launch Code has probably done more for humanity than Square has, right? But maybe not, right? Square's reached hundreds of millions of people and helped them a little bit. Launch Code has saved and changed lives. How do you measure them? I don't know, right? But I'll tell you that Square made a hell of a lot more money than Launch Code did. So if you want to treat them as businesses, you got Square and Launch Code, So I wasn't able to do that. Great question. I don't know how to answer it.
Yeah, I think about, and I'll circle back with you, but as I read the book, I was thinking about the civil rights movement. There have been so many movements leading up to that, and the measurement was all of the things that came as a result of the civil rights movement. But they used different tactics. They created a stack that looked different than the stack in the past. And you can think about what's happening right now in terms of social justice movement. The stack just looks differently. You've got these cell phones, and you've got these stories that you're seeing with your eyes, and everything that goes around that. So I do think that there is an application within social justice if we look harder.
I hope so. Yeah. It's a powerful idea. And the idea is basically that new is hard, right? And that new usually isn't one thing. New is usually this combination of things. And if it's going to be really impactful, it's probably not this, single invention. It's probably dozens of things that collectively become powerful.
Yeah. Jim, you said if you view every problem through the lens of the Serenity Prayer, a small subset of problems come sharply into focus. Those unsolved problems we have the power and courage to solve. They are perfect problems. When thinking about the St. Louis region, what should those with power and influence have the courage to change, and why?
I would say the first thing for those who have power and influence is to give up the power partially to gain more influence. And that's an interesting dynamic, because if you're powerful, you're sort of powerful in a region. You're powerful in this little area, right? You have control over this thing. Maybe it's a company, maybe it's your family, maybe it's just you, or maybe it's a local government or a larger organization, or there's some sphere. The problem is that sphere is not all encompassing. And we've got a weak political structure in St. Louis. We have a weak mayor, not that Light is weak. The position of mayor is weak. It's defined. It's a weak, the mayor, whoever it is, doesn't have that much power compared to other mayors, and certainly not compared to whoever's running Singapore, right? So the problem is you have many, many powerful people, but they're these little spheres and they don't connect. So to connect, the people have to sort of collectively share their power and relinquish it in many cases. So you don't, you're used to having everything you say go in your sphere, and yet to do anything effective, you have to be able to step out of that sphere. So relinquishing that power is difficult. And the only people I've seen do it successfully are people who are incredibly secure as individuals. So it's tough to do, but I think we got to do it because, a lot of these problems are not going to be solved just because one dedicated individual, powerful as he or she may be, chooses to do something.
That's actually a really fascinating and great point, and a tremendous lesson of leadership. No matter whether we're talking about a region or a corporation, those individuals who are secure in themselves, they share power, and those who are not, they want absolute power. React to this: power concedes nothing without a demand.
I guess I disagree with that. Although it's true in most cases. Like if you're truly powerful, you can be very, very generous. Either because you don't care to maintain the power, or because you're so powerful, you're not worried. But I would agree that in most cases, you know what, or if I'm probably not very qualified to speak on the topic of power. It's just it's nothing I've ever played with. I mean, most of the status that I've gotten has been because Square was a successful company and LaunchCode was a successful nonprofit. And before that, which was most of my life, nobody really cared, and including me. So, it's just not an area of expertise for me.
So what if we shift it from power to privilege? If you changed out the word power for privilege, does that trigger anything for you?
Yeah, that's a little closer to home because I grew up pretty privileged. I grew up in Ladue. My dad was a professor and then a dean at WashU, so I had a great upbringing, and I grew up around tremendous privilege. I mean, a lot of people who grew up around me were really very, very well off. But my mom was from a poor family in New York that unfortunately her dad was a brewmaster during Prohibition. So he was a German guy, and he immigrated from Germany, and he knew how to brew beer, and then they made that illegal, and he had 3 kids. So you get Prohibition plus a depression, and my mom was pretty poor growing up. So she kind of gave me that feeling, even though I was living in a pretty privileged situation. I'm not a big believer in generational wealth. And I've said this publicly, and I think I've pissed off some of the people that I know. But with rare exception, most of the people I know who've inherited a lot of money have been not too happy and not too productive. And the productive part I can understand because, well, if you don't have to worry, why would you, right? But the happy part surprised me. But I think inheriting a lot of money makes you feel sort of guilty. And I've noticed this with some of my friends who grew up rich. They don't have the freedom that comes from having a lot of money and earning it yourself. You earn a bunch of money yourself, you can pretty much do stupid stuff with it. And I've done some stupid stuff with some of my money. But it's my money. Now, if I'd inherit it from my grandfather or from my grandmother, well, then it's not really my money, is it? I kind of get to deal with it for a while, and then I got to pass it along another generation forward because that's sort of the unwritten rule. You got to pass it along. And I think that there's I think that there's a constraint that comes with it, and it's the inability to be called stupid. So I backed a company in St. Louis called Immunophotonics. this was 5 or 6 years ago, they had a very promising cancer treatment, but it was a promising cancer treatment that the medical community was rejecting. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but I'll tell you that the medical community is overly conservative when it comes to sort of experimental treatments. And I looked at this and I said, wow, this could actually be, a reasonable way of addressing cancer, which I know is killing people. So why wouldn't we be investing in this? But it turns out that nobody was investing in it. So I was like, well, what the hell? I made it. I'll blow it. I gave them a bunch of money. And lo and behold, 5 years later, now they're testing a cancer drug in Switzerland. It might actually work. Hasn't worked yet, but it might. Like it might actually work. If this thing saves lives, then, that's probably that's probably the single biggest thing I'll do in my lifetime, is backing a drug that probably wouldn't exist except for the idiot who made his own money and can piss it away. Okay, now let's say I'd inherited that money from my grandpa. And I say, well, it might not work, probably not going to work, and I don't understand anything about biology. So am I really going to give that money to this experimental thing and risk being called an idiot at the family? Probably not. Basically every real estate professional in St. Louis thinks I'm an idiot for buying the Post-Dispatch and putting $100 million into it. I see James Thomas laughing. He's going to fall out of his chair. Yeah, that was pretty stupid. I mean, as a real estate deal, it doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm doing it for other reasons. I think that we can make St. Louis a talent beacon for a lot of great people. And I wanted the people who work in the Square office in St. Louis to feel the same swagger that they feel when they walk into New York or Tokyo or Melbourne, Australia, and we've got these multi-million-dollar offices for them. I wanted them to have a multi-million-dollar office, so we're going to have a pretty damn nice office. But you only do that if you can be an idiot. So I can do that because, well, otherwise I just have to give it to the United Way.
United Way would like that.
I know they would, and they do good stuff with it. But, I also think that, again, even the United Way has to be conservative, right? They've got to be super responsible. Like if you're trying to get money out of the United Way as a charity, there's a long form. There's a lot of review because they can't be irresponsible. I think you want to have at least a little bit of irresponsible behavior with people taking risks that other people can't take.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you have worked for money, for the money and earned it, you have the ability to do so much more and experiment. And that's the whole point of your design and desire to be an entrepreneur. You're looking to solve problems, and sometimes you've got to go about that in unconventional ways. Jim, you talked a lot in your book about the walled city and the opportunity that lies on the other side of the wall. One of your quotes was, for those who choose to leave the walled city, two types of motivation matter: perseverance and audacity. Tell me some more about how you define perseverance and audacity in the context of creating a more equitable region.
So, perseverance, let's define the two terms. Perseverance is the ability to keep going. Audacity is the ability to start going. So audacity is the thing where you sit there and say, yeah, I know we've got these problems and nobody's ever been able to figure out how to solve them, but I'm audacious enough to think that myself and my group can address this problem, even though nobody's ever done it before. Now, you may be right, you may be wrong, and we'll figure out over time if you are. And that's going to require perseverance. The interesting thing that I found in the book is that the more audacious you are, the less you need perseverance. Because if you choose a truly audacious goal, then you will be so far outside of what society supports that you will have to persevere, or otherwise your entire enterprise will perish. So the audacious goals either die or succeed massively. They don't end up as these sort of mediocre or half-assed things. So I've always thought in terms of, myself as somebody who doesn't have a lot of perseverance. Sometimes I do if my life is threatened, but generally I'm kind of lazy. So I've always used Audacity as this sort of crutch to motivate myself. So I'll pick a big problem, and then there'll be so much stuff I have to do that I can motivate myself, and I don't have to worry about the fact that my perseverance is sort of compromised.
So in the book, you distinguish between ordinary business leaders and entrepreneurs. Tell me more about that, an entrepreneur.
So an entrepreneur in its original definition meant somebody who was doing something differently in business. It is, over the last 100 years, sort of mutated to mean the same thing as anyone who's starting a business. So if you start a business, you're an entrepreneur. But most of the businesses that people start are not unique. You open a restaurant, that's a tough business. And we'll call you an entrepreneur today because that's how the word is used. But there are a lot of people who've opened restaurants. You can go to a trade show and figure out how to open a restaurant. You can hire consultants. I mean, hell, there's a TV show where some guy will show up and shout at you and tell you how to run your restaurant better. Like there's a whole industry of knowledge there that already exists. You don't have to invent anything. You got to work hard. But we use the same word for that person as for somebody who's doing something that's never been done before. And I found it really limiting because I wanted to talk about the world of business that had never been done. I wanted to talk about what it's like to do stuff where there is no trade show you can go to, where you can't just hire an expert to save your ass when something goes wrong. And because of that, I discovered that the English language doesn't even have a word for that sort of behavior. And I was like, I can't write this book because I don't have a word. And so I started looking for words, and in my looking for words, I happened to discover that the original use of entrepreneur was that. The original use was somebody who hadn't done something in business. And the important thing is that it's a different sort of calculus when you're doing something that hasn't been done before. And most of us have been trained throughout our lives to be really good at copying, okay? This is what your education is. This is what your professional credentials is. This is what your family relationships are, right? You know what? You know how to be a good member of a social group? Do what everybody else is doing, okay? If they're setting cars on fire and burning buildings, you want to be setting cars on fire and burning buildings. Like if you're part of the crazy mob and you want good behavior in the mob, then you behave like the mob does, right? And if you are in grade school and everyone is yelling on the playground, you should yell on the playground. If they're sitting quietly in the class, you sit quietly in the class. You do what everybody else does. You copy. That's good behavior. And we're so used to living our lives as good copyists that occasionally when we run into some situation where we can't copy, we say, oh, can't deal with it. And that's terrible. That's a crime, because that's where very, very qualified people, very, very capable people, I won't say qualified, I'll say capable people, not qualified people, capable, unqualified people, because nobody can be qualified to do something the first time it's done. They quit. And that was breaking my heart, because I see all these problems and I'm like, wait a second, we can't have all our talent on the sidelines when we need invention, when we need something new. Like I want 1 million or 10 million people or 100 million people when they run across that problem that hasn't been solved before, to sit there and go, oh, I recognize now that this is a new type of problem, and I recognize that I'm going to feel weird doing it because I'm used to feeling comfortable copying, and I feel weird when I do stuff that's new, but yet it's possible to do stuff that's new and the results can be tremendous.
So I've been thinking about this term entrepreneur and thinking about it within the context of VC, and less than 1% of VC funds go to minority businesses. When you think about the U.S. in general, there are 30 million small businesses. If I just take the Black population, it's about 12%, and the business tied to that population is about 6%. Can you just give some reaction to the VC and to this idea of how you create an environment where there's more diverse ownership, equity?
Well, I mean, it's not just VC. VC is going to follow whatever. So here's the thing about capital. It's incredibly fluid and incredibly greedy. So all you have to do is present something that is potentially lucrative, and they'll shower you with money. That said, it's not surprising to me that the people who have access to, the systems are disproportionately white and male. But that's not just VC. Hell, that's a lot of stuff. And but I wouldn't say that we should get around that by trying to sort of address it at the VC level, because that you don't have to worry about venture capital. It's just going to go wherever the money is. So just make yourself a good investment, and they'll pile into you. They don't care what you look like, right? Actually, is that true? Shit. No, there's probably some racial bias there, but the good news is that there's enough that isn't racially biased that money will just out earn the other money. So don't worry about it. The economics of that will fix itself. What I'm more concerned about is all the steps before. So how do you get people who are not traditionally exposed to these ideas to get the ideas, right? How do we get ideas like innovation is different into the hands of people who are potentially great entrepreneurs? And I would say that there's great hope in one area, and that is, in my research, when I studied these world-changing companies, they were all started by basically unqualified outsiders. So if you look at all the companies that I studied, these were people who didn't matter that they had no qualifications, didn't matter that they didn't understand the industry that they were in, didn't matter, whatever their personal situation was, because they were basically unqualified, but they did it anyway. And I think that may be more empowering, because my guess is that a lot of people who, and I'm just guessing, but I got to believe that, some of it is societal barriers and bias, and some of it else is people just disqualifying themselves, And as a matter of fact, I wrote the book for a person who, I've seen her disqualify herself from stuff that I think she could do, but she doesn't think she could do it. So she says, well, I'm not going to do that. And that's because we've all been trained so much that we should only do stuff that we're qualified to do. Well, you can't be qualified to do something the first time. So just recognize when that is kicking in and hopefully overcome it. And if we could spread that attitude around the people who have been excluded, we might see an entrepreneurial surge there.
So, Jim, we're going to pause with questions from me. We've got just about 7 minutes, and we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. I'll ask you one final question, so we will leave 60 seconds for that. Nicole.
Yeah, Jim, just a couple questions came through the chat I wanted to make sure we addressed. In your opinion, what would be the fastest, most audacious way to lift the greatest number of people out of poverty in the St. Louis area?
Build the best school in the country in Velda Village. You pick. I don't care, any place north of Delmar. Go put a $100 million educational facility and make it free to everybody who lives in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Just make it so. I think that would do some very interesting things. I don't know if it worked. I mean, I don't know if any of my ideas work, but
some of your ideas obviously work.
You have, yeah.
Okay, I've got some other questions here for you. Sorry, bear with me just a second. Trying to dig them out. I have a question for Orv. Somebody wants to know what's on your shirt, Orv. You mentioned your shirt at the beginning, but we couldn't see it.
There's nothing on the shirt. In my last conversation with Jim, I asked him a question about some question, and we got on wardrobe, and he was wearing a donated shirt. So I figured I would go back and just take a T-shirt out the closet. And Jim, I didn't even iron it.
No, you don't iron T-shirts. That's bad form.
Nicole,
Jim,
other questions?
I'll ask you one more, Jim, and then I'll toss you back over to Orv. It's interesting to hear feedback, Jim, that you're a different kind of thinker, the judgmental nature of our community for different thinkers. What have you done to stay in your truth?
Well, that's assuming that I do, but I'm just so used to it now. Yeah, I've been doing this. I've been an outlier since high school, very much in college, and then it really accelerated after I graduated. So I'm just so callous that I don't react as badly anymore. Mm-hmm. Which is why I put the word crazy in the subtitle of the book, because like being called crazy to me doesn't insult me anymore, but it's probably not a compliment. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, the way I did it was just sheer repetition. Like, I don't know, maybe there's some way to sort of, philosophically, embrace some higher power. I don't know. I've never been able to do that. I just, through sheer repetition, I become numb.
And one more before we toss it back over to Orv. If a person has an innovative idea, but not a full circle of support around them, how do you overcome that lack of resources, that circle?
Oh, it's a great question. If you have a truly innovative idea, almost by definition, you will not have support around you. Mm-hmm. Because remember, the people who love you and care for you want you to succeed. And what that means to them is you should do what feels comfortable to them. You're only going to get support if you're doing something that's not innovative. If you're doing something and all your friends, people who dearly care about you, are saying, hey, Nicole, that's a stupid idea, then you might actually be doing something innovative. Mm-hmm. Now, understand that they're not trying to hold you back. What they're trying to do is they're trying to protect you using the logic that they have in their heads. So you have to respect that logic and still ignore their input. And that's tough to do, but it's easier to do if you understand that they genuinely care for you and you can tell you that. And then only after you're successful will they change their minds.
I think that's a great point. It's kind of like going from the nonprofit sector into banking. That's a stupid idea, or what are you thinking? One final question for you, Jim. You have done much with your wealth to advantage those with less. How can someone make a difference in the absence of such wealth? In other words, can one help without being able to bring money to the table?
Yeah. I mean, most of the stuff I did was without money. I mean, I started Launch Code for 20 grand. That's all it took to get it off the ground. And we raised money. I haven't given tens of millions of dollars to Launch Code. It's doing great stuff. Now we're raising some funds, I think you guys even donate, but the point is, it was the idea and the effort, not the bankroll. And even if we didn't have the $20,000, that would have just meant a little bit different trajectory. We could have done that for $50, you know, could have done it for free. We launched Square for next to nothing. I mean, Jack and I had literally no money in that business when it started. You know, we paid some payroll out of our pockets, and then we got paid back by the VCs. Like, if you think money is the problem, you're probably thinking wrong.
I want to thank you, Jim. I want to thank the St. Louis American Red Latina for the partnership here. Nicole, back to you.
Wonderful. Everybody, yes, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Jim and Orv, for the wonderful discussion, and for everyone for their patience as we work through some technical issues. We're going to be sending out a brief survey later today, so please keep an eye out for that and provide your candid feedback. We do use that for future events. Included in that email will be a link to the position paper that Orv wrote that he mentioned on this call today, Shared Prosperity, Our Corporate Responsibility in a Time of Consternation. We encourage you to read this paper and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Again, if you'd like to be entered to win a 1-hour session with Jim where you can discuss your big idea, please email heyorbstl@midwestbankcenter.com by the end of the day today. Thank you all again for joining Midwest Bank Center, and we will see you next time.